You were born in Ambala, so you were born in India.
I was born in India, and the Jesuits say the first years of a child's life are the most important and bond it forever to whoever is with it. So I feel bonded to India.
But in a military cantonment?
I was born in a military cantonment. My father was in the Indian Army, and we left when I was 8. We lived our wonderfully, always trying to find out how old I am. So in 1940, my father stayed on for a year, so we left in 1948. And he was always saying, how old would you have been in 1948? And actually I was 8, so you can work that out for yourselves. And, but so my memories of India are pretty vivid, because at 8 years old you remember a lot of things.
And somehow you ended up in the typing pool at the Northern Echo, which seemed very implausible to me.
Yes, I went to do a secretarial course, because in my day girls didn't go to universities. Well, some girls were lucky enough to go, but in an average family, boys went, but girls didn't go. And so I did a secretarial course, and then of course I was meant to get married. But I didn't get married. I went into the typing pool of the Northern Echo instead. And then from there, and it was an extraordinary thing, because the Northern Echo at that time was edited by Harry Evans, who later became the editor of the Sunday Times. And I slowly made my way to the Sunday Times via the Daily Express.
And being sacked from the Observer.
That was a sort of high point of my career. I was editor of the Observer.
But then AW rescued you from being a hack for the rest of your life.
Yes, well then, except I had the most wonderful job. I was I was young fashion editor. There was an older fashion editor, and then there was me. And it was the early 60s, and Jean Shrimpton, David Bailey, absolutely wonderful. But then love conquered all, and I gave it all up to marry A.W. and go and live in this chicken shed that was mentioned earlier. And it really, I wish I had a slide of it, because it really, really was a chicken shed. So then the next 40 years, 37 to 40 years, Alan pursued...
Oh, you've outed him.
Oh, I've outed him. Anyway, A.W. pursued his career, and I sort of came along behind. And then, at one point we were posted to Brussels, and I started a diary, because I'd gone to the dentist in Brussels. It was a man called Mr. Hellman, Dr. Hellman. And after he'd done my teeth, he said, can you stay on a little longer today, because I think I need to shorten your tongue. I said, what? And he said, I need to shorten it just a few millimetres off the end of your tongue. And I thought this was some kind of elaborate joke that A.W. had set up with the dentist, because I talked too much. But it wasn't. He really wanted to shorten my tongue. And in fact, since then, I've met somebody else who went to the same dentist, and he wanted to shorten his tongue as well. Anyway, I was telling this to somebody, and she said, would you keep a diary? Please keep a diary, because in 40 years' time, you will want all the stories you have, you will want to publish them. And so I kept the diary, and she said, you'll bring the diary to me, and we'll publish it. And she is somebody who works for Hodder Headline. So when I was in Kazakhstan and had nothing to do, I made this diary into diplomatic baggage and gave it to her, and that's how it came to be published.
Dip bag took you to India, Gambia, Trinidad, Syria.
Yes, it took us all over the world. It also took us through one revolution in Ethiopia and one terrible famine in Ethiopia, and 3 medical emergencies. I managed to cut my artery putting my hand through a window in Ethiopia, and poor A.W. once had to jump out of a window because I'd locked the bedroom door by mistake, and broke his ankles. And there've been various medical emergencies, and an army coup in the Gambia, and sort of all kinds of adventures.
Which makes Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan seem quite tame in comparison.
Yes.
Which are the
yes. Because Kazakhstan was very difficult, because basically it's an enormous country, but it's huge. It's bigger than Greater Europe, but it only had in our day 12 million people living there, and it's just all empty steppe. A.W. loved it, but I hated it. So, but in the end, I didn't hate it because I wrote diplomatic baggage there, and I loved doing that. Nothing in India ever quite worked out how it was intended. At a craft fair, I found a man making the most beautiful embroidered shoes. I ordered a pair, and since the shoemaker lived hundreds of miles from Delhi, I asked for them to be sent by post. But a few weeks later, the shoemaker himself turned up at the gate with my order. The shoes were exquisite, but enormous. Why did he make them so big, I asked him, when he had actually drawn round my foot on a piece of paper. He explained that he thought my feet might have grown in a few weeks. This, the human error factor, was what drove you bananas in Delhi, but it was also precisely the most endearing thing about the place, because it meant that you never knew what was going to happen next. In India, truth was always stranger than fiction. I was brought up to believe that reading novels before lunch was decadent. Chores had to be done first. For this reason, I always felt slightly guilty reading the Indian newspapers at breakfast. The stories were better than any book. Man bites snake to death. Stray dog steals newborn baby from hospital. Young girl kidnapped from her home 12 years before turns up on doorstep as a blind beggar and is recognised by an old servant and saved.
So you had a sort of ambivalent relationship with Delhi, but you loved Kashmir.
I love Kashmir. It all started off because my parents lived in India, and they'd both been born in India. And my mother had a few of those Kashmiri painted lacquer things, and I loved them. And I started to collect Kashmiri painted lacquer, and I had rather a beautiful collection. And then when I married A.W., we were posted to Brussels, and it was the first time I hadn't worked, and I'd retired. And I found it very, very, very difficult. So to cheer me up, A.W. took us all to Kashmir. And there was no guide. We spent 6 weeks in Kashmir. There was no guidebook. So I decided that I would... Should I read a bit from the Kashmir book? We did have one gem of a book lent to us by our houseboat owner. This was Dr. Duke's Kashmir Handbook, written in 1888. This guide gave us a feel for the place all right, but in the wrong century. Travellers to Kashmir in those days were a different breed. You have only to read the list of items that the doctor advises visitors to bring with them to see what a stoic and self-sufficient lot they were. Apart from medicines to counteract diarrhea, dysentery, constipation, fevers, headaches, snow blindness, chilblains, frostbite, wounds and dog bite, and not forgetting that castor oil should always find a place. The doctor insists upon gum lancets, abscess lances, and some soft catheters. I mention the latter, he writes, as in 1875, had one of these instruments been available, a life might have been saved in the wilds of Kashmir. Since then, I have always carried one in my gun case. All the years I was a journalist on the Sunday Times and writing things like the book about Kashmir, but I never actually wrote anything deliberately to try and be funny. And then, when I was 48 years old, I bought a little home moustache waxing kit. And it said, apply the wax with the spatula provided, and then whisk away the superfluous hair. So I whisked away the superfluous hair and whisked away my whole upper lip at the same time. So then I had this terrible wound on my which then turned into a kind of black scab, so it looked like Hitler. And I then happened to meet a colleague of Claire's at The Guardian, Felicity Lawrence, and she said, what on earth have you done? So I told her the whole story, and she laughed and laughed and laughed, and then she said, could you write it as funnily as you've told me for the Telegraph magazine, which she was editing at that time?
One of the things that comes out of this book, which I thought was fascinating, was the extent to which, as a travelling spouse, you're the intersection between the servant class and the very poppy people.
Yes, and people always say expats never stop talking about their servants, but basically it's because the servants have very often had the most riveting lives. Our cook in Syria had been an armed guard in a bank, and her life had been incredible. But also, in these lonely days when you first arrive there and you don't know anybody and the phone never rings, this woman who might be your maid, well, nearly everybody who goes abroad gets some help in the house, and so you will nearly always have a maid. And then when your husband becomes an ambassador, you're allowed to have a cook, which sounds very grand, but actually you can never find a cook. And so you're always training up a maid to become a cook, which means that you end up doing the cooking yourself half the time. So it all sounds much grander than it is. But these people become very dear to you, and you learn an enormous amount about the country from these people.
There's an awful lot about culinary mishaps in your life, aren't there? Things are always going wrong for meals.
Everybody has to do this entertaining, which is supposed to be representational. That means you have to put on a meal that you can, as an English person, you can be proud of, that foreigners are going to see that you can do things properly. And it's a nightmare because you're in a place where you probably can't get half the ingredients for the dishes you want to make. And every expat, would you agree, has a disaster dinner party story. Our greatest friend in Delhi had a cook who was very often drunk. And once he came to work saying he was sorry, but his bicycle had slipped on a banana skin. And he used to like serving the courses in the wrong order, so he'd serve the main dish and then serve pâtés. He'd serve the main dish as the first course, coq au vin or something, and then he'd serve the second course, pâté as the second course. I mean, it's just the sort of logical consequence of trying to do something English in a completely foreign place. And also, I used to admire the staff, because you tell them, we went to a lunch party in Delhi once, and we had consommé as the soup to start with, and it had fresh cherries floating about in it. And all of the wives knew that the hostess had said to her cook, put some sherry in the food. And why did they know that you have to put sherry in consommé? So they thought you meant cherries. So they'd gone to a huge amount of trouble to put fresh cherries in the soup. And it's, I could never understand how anybody could ever get a representational meal on the table, given the circumstances in which it was being created. A.W. brought a terrible red baseball cap in the bazaar when we first arrived in Sri Lanka. I told him that plump elderly men in caps look awful, e.g. Michael Moore. But this is a diary, so it's in the present tense. He's wearing it doggedly. I don't know what the peak is made of, titanium. But this afternoon he leaned over my deck chair to give me a kiss, and the peak jabbed into my forehead really painfully. It was like being pecked by a giant parrot.